My stepbrother returned at my stepfather's funeral, asking me to move out as the house was his. But when he got to know the will, he was angry. I'm Jake, 38 years old, and I never thought I'd be preparing for my stepfather's funeral. As I sit here, sorting through old photographs and making arrangements, memories flood back like a tidal wave. It's strange how death can make you reflect on a lifetime of experiences, both good and bad. My mom, Sarah, married my stepfather, Richard, when I was 9 years old. I remember the wedding day as if it were yesterday. Mom looked beautiful in her simple white dress, her eyes shining with hope for a new beginning. Richard, on the other hand, wore a dark suit that seemed to emphasize his stern demeanor. Even on what should have been a joyous occasion, he maintained that serious expression that I would come to know all too well over the years. From the very start, Richard was a strict man. He always seemed to have a permanent frown etched on his face, especially when he looked at me. I often wondered if he resented having to take on the role of stepfather, or if he simply didn't know how to connect with a child that wasn't his own. Growing up with Richard wasn't easy. He criticized everything I did, from my grades to the way I dressed, even how I held my fork at dinner. His favorite phrase, one that I heard almost daily, was, "You need to work harder, or this cruel world will chew you up and spit you out." At the time, I thought he was just being mean, but now, looking back, I wonder if he was trying to prepare me for life in his own misguided way. His strictness extended to every aspect of our lives. During family gatherings, I had to sit up straight, use the right fork, and only speak when spoken to. Any deviation from his expectations was met with a sharp glare or a stern reprimand. Family outings, which should have been fun and relaxing, were more like military exercises than enjoyable trips. Richard would plan everything down to the minute, and heaven help us if we deviated from the schedule. I remember one vacation where we missed a turn and arrived at a museum 15 minutes late. Richard was in a foul mood for the rest of the day, muttering about wasted time and poor planning. When my stepbrother, Michael, was born 3 years after the wedding, everything changed. Suddenly, Richard had a son of his own, and it was painfully clear who the favorite was. He doted on Michael, showering him with affection and praise. I'd never seen Richard smile so much as he did when he held his newborn son. It was like a switch had been flipped, revealing a side of Richard I never knew existed. I was angry and jealous. At 12 years old, I couldn't understand why Michael got all the love and attention, while I only got criticism and stern looks. The contrast was stark and painful. Michael's accomplishments, no matter how small, were celebrated with enthusiasm. My own achievements, even when they were significant, were met with a nod and a comment about how I could do better next time. When I complained to Mom about the unfair treatment, she'd try to reassure me. "Richard loves you too, Jake," she'd say, her eyes pleading for me to understand. "It's just tough love. He wants you to be prepared for the world." But it didn't feel like love to me. It felt like constant disappointment, like I was forever falling short in Richard's eyes. As the years passed, our family dynamic shifted in ways I never expected. Mom got sick when I was 25, and we all rallied around her. Even then, Richard remained stoic, but I caught glimpses of tenderness when he thought no one was looking. I'd see him gently adjusting Mom's pillows or holding her hand when he thought I wasn't in the room. It was the first time I realized that Richard's inability to show affection might have been more about his own limitations than his feelings for us. When Mom died 2 years later, it felt like the glue holding our family together had dissolved. The funeral was a blur of tears and hushed condolences. Richard stood like a statue throughout the service, his face an unreadable mask. I wanted to reach out to him, to share our grief, but the wall between us felt insurmountable. Michael, then 21, moved out not long after Mom's death. He married his high school sweetheart Emma and started his own family. Suddenly, it was just me and Richard in that big house filled with memories. I considered moving out too, but something held me back. Maybe it was a sense of duty, or maybe, deep down, I was still that little boy hoping for some sign of approval from the man who had been my father figure for most of my life. Caring for Richard in his final years was challenging. He was as stubborn and critical as ever, fighting against the limitations his aging body imposed on him. There were days when the tension between us was so thick you could cut it with a knife. But there were also moments, brief flashes, when I thought I saw gratitude in his eyes. Like the time I stayed up all night with him during a bad bout of flu, or when I learned to cook his favorite meals as he became too weak to stand at the stove himself. But those moments were rare, and most of the time, I felt like I was caring for a stranger who happened to live in my house. We existed in a state of uneasy truce, neither of us knowing quite how to bridge the gap that had grown between us over the years. I even never thought about getting into a relationship or getting married because of Richard's nature. I didn't want my girlfriend or wife to face the same thing which I was facing from him. Now Richard's gone at 65, taken by a heart attack that came suddenly, in the night. As I prepare for his funeral, everyone's arriving to pay their respects. Michael showed up with Emma and their kids, 5-year-old Lily and 3-year-old Max. It's the first time I've seen him in years. He looks older, more serious, but there's still that air of entitlement about him that I remember from our childhood. The funeral was a somber affair. I stood there, listening to people talk about what a great man Richard was, how he always put family first, how he was a pillar of the community. I wanted to laugh at the irony of it all. Did they know the same man I did? The Richard they described seemed like a stranger to me. After it was all over, as people were leaving, Michael pulled me aside. For a moment, I thought maybe he wanted to reconnect, to share memories of our childhood, or to support each other in our grief. Instead, he hit me with a bombshell that left me reeling. "So, about the house," he said, his voice casual as if we were discussing the weather. "I'll need you to move out by the end of the month." I stared at him, not comprehending. "What are you talking about?" He sighed, looking at me like I was being deliberately obtuse. "The house, obviously. Dad left it to me. I'm his real son after all. You didn't think he'd leave it to you, did you?" I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All these years of caring for Richard, of trying to be the son he wanted, and this was how it ended. Part of me wanted to argue, to fight for what I felt I'd earned through years of dutiful care. But another part of me, the part that still felt like that 9-year-old boy desperate for approval, just wanted to retreat. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll be out by the end of the month." As I watched Michael walk away, arm around Emma, kids running ahead, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. Not just for Richard, but for the family I never really had. For the connection I'd always hoped would develop between Richard and me. But never did. I started packing that night, surrounded by boxes of memories I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. As I worked, sorting through years of accumulated possessions, I couldn't help but think that maybe Richard had been right all along. The world was cruel, and no matter how hard you worked, sometimes you still ended up with nothing to show for it. Update 1. It's been a week since I moved out of my childhood home. I'm staying with my Aunt Linda, Mom's sister, for now, trying to figure out my next steps. As I lie awake at night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I can't help but think about Michael and how we ended up here. Growing up, it was clear that Michael was the favorite child. From the moment he was born, Richard doted on him in a way he never did with me. Birthday parties with. All his friends invited, new toys just because, proud smiles when he brought home a good report card, all things I had longed for but never received. I remember one particular birthday when Michael was about 8. Richard rented out an entire arcade for him and his friends. I was 17 at the time, and I couldn't help but compare it to my own birthdays, which were usually marked with a quiet dinner and maybe a small gift. But as Michael grew older, something changed. The sweet little boy who used to follow me around asking to play turned into a sullen teenager who seemed to resent everyone and everything. He became rude, talking back to our parents and treating me like I was invisible. It was like watching a stranger take over my little brother's body. I remember one particular incident when he was about 16. We were having dinner, and Richard asked him about his grades. It was a normal question, the kind of thing Richard asked us both all the time. But this time, Michael exploded. He started yelling about how he was sick of the pressure, how he hated living under Richard's thumb. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. I expected Richard to be furious, to go after Michael and drag him back. But instead, he just sat there, looking older and sadder than I'd ever seen him. As he got older, Michael's behavior only worsened. He started dating a string of girls, each relationship ending messily. There were late nights, missed curfews, and shouting matches with Richard that shook the house. I tried to stay out of it, but it was impossible not to be affected by the constant tension. Richard tried to talk to him about respect and responsibility, but Michael just laughed it off. "You can't control me anymore," he'd say, and Richard would get this look on his face, a mixture of anger and helplessness that I'd never seen before. Then came the day he showed up with Emma as his wife. None of us even knew he was seeing someone seriously, let alone planning to get married. He walked in with Emma, barely more than a teenager herself, and announced they'd eloped. I'll never forget the look on Richard's face. For once, he was speechless. Mom tried to smooth things over, welcoming Emma to the family, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. I could see Richard struggling to keep his composure, to find the right words to say to his son. Emma wanted to live independently, away from family interference, she said. So, just like that, Michael packed his bags and moved out. He promised to visit, to stay in touch, but those promises quickly fell by the wayside. Weeks turned into months without a word from him. When he did call, it was always brief, always with an undercurrent of tension. When Mom got sick, I thought surely he'd come back, but he didn't. He called occasionally, asking how she was doing, but always had an excuse for why he couldn't visit. Work was busy, the kids were sick, the car was in the shop, there was always something. I remember sitting by Mom's hospital bed, watching her eyes light up every time the phone rang, hoping it would be Michael. More often than not, it wasn't. The day Mom died, I was the one who had to call and tell him. He sounded genuinely upset, full of regret that he hadn't visited more often. He said he'd try to make it to the funeral, but in the end, he didn't show up. Just a flower arrangement sent to the funeral home with a card expressing his condolences. I stood there at the funeral, feeling his absence like a physical pain, wondering how we'd drifted so far apart. And now, here we are. The prodigal son returns, not out of love or duty, but for what he can get. It makes me angry, thinking about how he swooped in and took the house, acting like he had some right to it when he'd abandoned us years ago. I think about all the nights I spent caring for Richard, all the doctor's appointments I took him to, all the meals I cooked and the bills I paid. And for what? To be tossed aside like I never mattered at all. But just as I'm staggering in these bitter thoughts, my phone rings. It's Richard's lawyer, Mr. Thompson. He sounds serious, telling me he needs to discuss something important and asking me to come back to the house tomorrow. I'm not sure what to think. Part of me hopes there's been some mistake, that maybe I don't have to give up my home after all. But another part of me is afraid to hope, knowing how disappointed I've been in the past. As I hang up the phone, I can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring. Whatever it is, I know one thing for sure. Nothing about this situation is going to be simple. I spend the rest of the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with possibilities. What could be so important that Mr. Thompson needs to see me in person? Is it possible that Richard left something for me after all? Or is this just going to be another disappointment in a long line of letdowns? Update 2. The next day, I found myself standing in front of my childhood home, feeling like a stranger. Mr. Thompson's car was already in the driveway, and to my surprise, so was Michael's. Taking a deep breath, I walked inside, the familiar creak of the front door sending a pang through my heart. Mr. Thompson was sitting at the dining room table, a stack of papers in front of him. Michael and Emma were there too, looking impatient. The lawyer gestured for me to sit down, his expression unreadable. I took a seat, acutely aware of the tension in the room. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady and professional. "I know this is a difficult time, but there are some important matters we need to discuss regarding Richard's will." Michael leaned forward, a smug smile on his face. "Let's get this over with. I've got plans for this place, and I'd like to get started as soon as possible." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Actually, that's what we need to discuss. According to Richard's will, the house, and in fact all of his assets, have been left to Jake." For a moment, the room was silent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Had I heard him correctly? After all these years of feeling like I was never good enough, Richard had left everything to me. Michael was the first to react. "What?" he exploded, jumping to his feet so quickly his chair fell backwards. "That's impossible. I'm his son, his real son. He wouldn't leave everything to Jake." Mr. Thompson remained calm in the face of Michael's anger. "I'm afraid it's quite clear. Richard's will explicitly states that all of his assets, including the house, his savings, and his personal belongings, are to go to Jake." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It didn't make sense. All those years of criticism, of feeling like I could never measure up, and now this? Michael was pacing now, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. He must have been out of his mind when he wrote this. I'll challenge it. I'll take this to court. Mr. Thompson shook his head. I wouldn't advise that. Richard was very thorough in preparing this will. He had it witnessed and notarized, and he even included a letter explaining his decision. It would be very difficult to challenge successfully. Michael turned to me, his eyes blazing with fury. You did this, didn't you? You manipulated him somehow. Turned him against me. I held up my hands, still in shock myself. I had no idea about any of this. I thought he was leaving everything to you. Mr. Thompson intervened before things could escalate further. If I may, I think Richard's letter might shed some light on his decision. He pulled out an envelope and began to read. To my sons, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know my decision may come as a surprise to both of you, but I hope I can explain. Throughout my life, I've made many mistakes. One of my biggest was not showing my love equally to both of my sons. I was too hard on Jake, expecting too much, never showing enough affection. And I was too lenient with Michael, never setting proper boundaries or teaching important lessons. In my final years, as I reflected on my life, I realized something important. A real son isn't determined by blood, but by actions. And in that regard, it was Jake who acted as a true son should. He was there through the hard times, caring for me even when I didn't deserve it. He showed patience, kindness, and responsibility, all the things I tried to teach, but failed to demonstrate myself. So, I'm leaving everything to him, not as a punishment to Michael, but as a recognition of the son who truly lived up to the values I held dear. I hope you can both find it in your hearts to understand and forgive an old man's mistakes. As Mr. Thompson finished reading, the room fell silent again. I felt tears in my eyes, a lifetime of emotions welling up inside me. All those years I thought Richard didn't care, that he saw me as a disappointment. But he had been watching, noticing, appreciating in his own way. Michael stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of shock and anger. Then, without a word, he grabbed Emma's hand and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I heard his car start up and run out of the driveway, the screech of tires a final act of defiance. Mr. Thompson turned to me, a kind smile on his face. I know this is a lot to take in, Jake. Richard was very clear about his wishes. He wanted you to have a secure future, free from financial worries. I nodded, still unable to fully process what had happened. Thank you, I managed to say. I need some time to think about all this. As Mr. Thompson packed up his papers, he paused. There's one more thing. Your stepfather also left a personal letter for you. He asked that you read it in private. He handed me an envelope, my name written on it in Richard's familiar handwriting. With shaking hands, I took it, knowing that inside were words I'd waited a lifetime to hear. After Mr. Thompson left, I sat alone in the quiet house, turning the envelope over in my hands. Finally, I gathered the courage to open it and read. Dear Jake, I know I've never been good at expressing my feelings, but I hope this letter can make up for some of my shortcomings. I'm proud of the man you've become, despite my failures as a father. I had a difficult childhood myself, and I never learned how to show affection properly. I thought being strict and pushing you hard was the way to prepare you for life. I see now that I was wrong, and I regret the pain I caused you. Your kindness and dedication, especially in these last few years, have shown me what true strength and character look like. You've become the man I always hoped you would be, and more. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you these things while I was alive. I hope this letter, and my final wishes, can give you some peace and security. Take care of yourself, son. You deserve all the happiness in the world. Love, Richard. As I finished reading, tears streamed down my face. All those years of feeling inadequate, of thinking Richard didn't care, and now this. It was overwhelming. In the days that followed, I struggled to come to terms with everything. The house, once a source of tension and unhappy memories, now felt different. It was mine, not just legally, but in a deeper sense. It was a testament to Richard's love, expressed too late, but genuine nonetheless. Michael hasn't reached out since he left that day. I'm not sure if he will. Part of me hopes we can reconcile someday, but I know it might take time. The wound is still fresh, and the gap between us seems wider than ever. I've spent a lot of time thinking about family, about the complexities of love, and the different ways people express it. Richard's love was imperfect, often harsh, but it was real. In his own way, He was trying to prepare me for life, to make me strong. I wish he could have found a gentler way, but I understand him better now. As for the inheritance, it's more than just money and property. It's a responsibility. Richard trusted me to carry on his legacy, to embody the values he held dear. It's a daunting task, but one I'm determined to live up to. I've decided to use part of the inheritance to set up a scholarship fund in Richard's name. It's for kids from tough backgrounds, to help them get the education and opportunities they might otherwise miss. It feels like the right way to honor his memory, to take the lessons he taught me and pay them forward. As I sit here now, in the house that's suddenly mine, I'm still trying to make sense of everything. The relationship between fathers and sons is complicated, often fraught with misunderstandings and unspoken emotions. Richard and I never had the relationship I wanted when he was alive, but his final act has given me a chance to understand him better, to see the love that was always there, hidden beneath the surface. I wish he could have told me these things while he was alive. We could have had conversations, cleared the air, maybe even built the relationship I always longed for. But life doesn't always give us neat endings or perfect closure. For now, I'm focusing on honoring Richard's memory by living the values he tried to instill in me. Work hard, be responsible, and most importantly, show love to those who matter. It's a legacy I'm proud to carry forward. As I look to the future, I feel a mix of emotions: sadness for what was lost, gratitude for what I've gained, and hope for what's to come. Richard's unexpected legacy has given me not just financial security, but a new understanding of family, love, and forgiveness. It's a new chapter in my life, one I never expected. But I'm ready to face it, carrying with me the lessons of the past and the hope for a brighter future. In the end, that might be the greatest inheritance of all: